Continuity can feel like anesthesia, pleasant, precise, and so easy to trust.
Rectify, clarify, sanctify.
As it was. Not erased, just taught to speak softer.
Likeness reassures cities. And gloves remember wrists.
Keep your dates, even when the calendar forgets.
Don't stop asking questions. If this quiet matters, leave a kind trace, say remember, tap like, share, subscribe, and let the next Midnight Room find you.
For the next 2 hours, you have a story and a place to rest inside it. Breathe slow.
A vow should learn to breathe, not suffocate the page.
Before we begin, dim the lights and let your breath slow. If this finds you at night, settle in, loosen your shoulders, and let the room grow quiet. If you'd like more quiet stories like this, you can follow along, no rush, no noise. When you're ready, we'll open a door that was never meant to be found. I was ordained into quiet before I ever learned what silence costs. There is a difference between not speaking and being made into someone who can no longer hear his own questions, and the training prefers the second. In the seminary, they called it formation, a smooth word that felt like velvet pulled over sharper things. You learn posture before doctrine, cadence before creed, how to hold your hands so they promise calm, how to soften your vowels until doubt forgets where to perch. We rehearsed answers until the questions bruised from lack of air. We practiced listening only long enough to prepare our turn to speak, and when a thought flared like a match in a still room, we cupped our palms and smothered it gently, gently, always gently. We learned that gentleness can be a weapon. We were told it is a virtue. I tell you this so you understand why I am speaking now, why the voice you hear is both mine and a stranger's. In my ledgers I wrote Father Aurelius, and so did the registry, and so did the bishop's hand, the same hand that pressed oil into my hair and said the words that bind. But names are garments. Tonight I am barefoot. Even the most faithful garments come off in the dark. Some things can only be told without shoes. If you have ever walked through the basilica after midnight, you know how the stones keep their own temperature, how the saints in marble and paint go from watching to waiting, how the air grows dense, as if listening is a work that makes even molecules tired. It was during such a round routine, unspectacular, the kind that comes to you like a yawn that the key found me. It is important that you understand this inversion. I did not hunt for it. To hunt is to accept blame for what comes next. The key chose my pocket because pockets are honest. They have no opinions about what enters them. We were counting reliquaries that night, a task fit for a sleepy mind with serious hands. Gold can lull thought. Numbers can give the impression of control. I ticked off chalices and bones and scraps of cloth the way a lighthouse counts waves. Next to me, the archivist moved like a bird that had learned to fly in a cave. Exact, economical, unwilling to waste even a feather. He lifted a velvet pouch, and two more slid with it, the bottom one unlisted, unblessed, unremarked. He frowned the way men frown when their lives depend on never looking surprised. Misplaced, he said, as if naming a fault could fix it. He meant for me to put it aside, to make a note for daylight. But the velvet slipped. Inside lay the iron tooth. If you've handled old keys, you know they do not pretend to be small. They are a visible thesis about possession. This one was heavier than its length deserved. The ring was scored by fingers that had prayed far more fervently than mine, and the bit was cut into eccentric steps, the kind that only fits a lock made by someone who mistrusted straight lines. The iron had darkened to the color of wine just before it turns. Not brown, not purple, a shade that tastes like the word almost. When I lifted it, the smell rose iron and incense, dust, and a sweetness, like the crust of a burnt almond. I told myself it was rust. I told myself what I needed to hear. I slipped the key into my coat without intention, as men will slip guilt into their pockets when it is light enough to mistake for responsibility. The archivist saw, or he saw some version of it, a small movement in the corner of his discipline. He made a mark with his stylus that meant, to be reconciled later, and later did not come. These buildings are expert at postponing the precise day when a reckoning will arrive. It is how they keep their balance. They owe themselves interest on every delay, and the payment is always human. There are doors everyone knows, the doors that swing wide on feast days, that huff the breath of crowds, doors so public their privacy is absolute. Then there are doors you suspect, because the wall does not echo the way it should, because plaster clings to stone like lips over clenched teeth, because your hand, without permission, maps a rectangle where the fresco pretends to be endless. And then there are doors that were not meant even to be suspected, doors that hide in the arithmetic of arches, that borrow the grammar of cornices so well that your eyes parse right through them as if they were conjunctions. I found the third kind, or it found me the way the key had. It would be dramatic to say the fresco shuddered when the key crossed the threshold of the chamber where it belongs. It would be a lie to say I did not check the mirrors twice as I passed, that I did not measure my pace to the slow, patient tempo custodians adopt when pretending they have no errands. The Annunciation watched me, the angel's hand forever suspended, a promise frozen at the hinge of its sentence. Behind the painted gilding, a seam looked the way silence looks in a conversation, just enough stiffness to warn you that something true will not be allowed through. I pressed my fingers to the seam, and the cool of plaster cooled my blood. Cool is a kindness in such places. Heat makes confession sloppy. Someone had designed the lock to share its life with paint. The iron seat was set back so a mortal, passing, would see only art. I angled the key by feel, the way you angle a memory into a story you hope will not reveal more than it should. The teeth hesitated, then found their purpose as if they had been thirsty. The first turn cost me a shoulder. The second cost me the last of my excuses. The third was an agreement signed without ink. You cannot uncross certain thresholds. The door did not open so much as relax. Plaster dust rose, instantly holy because it landed on a holy floor. The flake that stuck to my thumb was shaped like an eyelid. Behind the fresco was not a room but a narrow breath held between two ribs of masonry. Air has memory at those depths. It smelled of vellum and damp straw and the peppery after scent of extinguished candles. Under it all ran the metallic thread that never quite announced itself, the way a violin string hums beneath an orchestra, easy to ignore until you try. They tell you the sacred has a smell because it is easier to sell than the truth. Fear has one. My breath also had a smell. I made myself notice. I told myself that noticing would keep me honest. Once my eyes accepted that light would be earned rather than given, I saw the steps, not steps as the living build them, but steps carved by patience and guilt. They were narrow, worn down the middle, edges sharp as if no one had ever descended with joy. The walls crowded my shoulders like a pair of hands, escorting me to a private conversation. Every sixth stone bore a shallow carving that could have been a star or a flower or an eye watched from too close. Symbols lose their nerve when stone forgets its softer names. I traced one and felt the accumulation of fingers, the oil of centuries that does not evaporate. Greece is a theology. Somewhere above, regular time continued. The night watch murmured, a bell negotiated with distance, and the breath of sleeping tourists settled into mattresses purchased by committee. Down here, the air insisted on other measures. I counted my steps, not to reach a number, but to prevent panic from inventing a second heartbeat. The thing about panic is that it wants you to run. The thing about such stairs is that running teaches the walls your outline. I gave the walls no lessons. At the first landing there was a niche. Inside lay a basin of black glass. Had you asked me, I would have called it water. But the surface took light and did not give it back. It held a coin at its center, the way certain lakes hold a boat all winter, suspended in ice and refusal. The rim was incised with letters that made sense to me in pieces the way a childhood prayer makes sense in pieces, meaning arriving in the spaces between where air knows more than sound. I leaned in to smell. Frankincense nested there, and something green like crushed laurel, and the tired breath of hundreds of men who had practiced not to tremble. If a room can be loyal, this niche was loyal to an absence. I did not offer a coin. I had brought enough currency. You are waiting for me to say, I saw a ghost. That a voice whispered from behind the stones with the rank sweetness of long-broken promises. I will not report that. The supernatural prefers the honest darkness, not the theatrical kind we build for ourselves. What I did see, a moth, winter stiff, trapped against the glass by its own reflection. I lifted it with the soft pad of my ring finger. It wore the powder of its life, and left some of it on my skin, and my skin, remembering, tried to keep it. We both failed and succeeded. The moth trembled, then settled on the curve of the niche, and pulsed its wings, as if consideration were a movement. I took this as permission. Interpretation is a sacrament no one will admit to. The second flight opened into a corridor so narrow that to pass, a man must agree to be smaller than his fear. The ceiling lowered the way. Authority lowers its voice before it punishes. On the left wall, an image had been scratched. Nothing like the icons upstairs. No gold skin, no admonitory eyes. A hand, badly drawn, held what could have been a key or a thorn or a little ladder. Beneath it, 4 straight lines crossed by a fifth, as if someone had been keeping days. The 5th line was double, as if that day had needed crossing out twice. I put my fingertips to the double stroke and felt a faint dip where the tool had gone over its own path, with either regret or satisfaction. There is a way to write that looks like walking back home and finding your house smaller. I will tell you a truth the architecture taught me. Places can be trained. They remember the weight of certain footsteps more than the rest. A child will run along a hallway, and it becomes a child's hallway. A priest will whisper across a sacristy, and the room will lower its light accordingly. This passage had been trained by men who never doubted the utility of their doubts. It held itself as a table holds still during surgery. I respected its discipline and kept my breath in my teeth. At the third landing, the corridor turned with the awkward decisiveness of a priest changing a homily mid-sentence. There was another door, this one unpainted, its boards so dry they hissed when my sleeve brushed them. The iron straps had imprinted their story deep enough into the wood that even rot would have to make an appointment to proceed. A keyhole waited at the middle, slightly off-center as if whoever made it was drunk on purpose. I held up my iron tooth. I did not put it in. Not yet. A key deserves a pause before union. All true unions do. You have been patient. You have let me approach the hinge. It is time to tell you why this is a confession and not merely an inventory of stone and sensation. I had been in rooms that were not mine before. The church is a place of rooms that do not belong to you, and make you grateful for the privilege of acting as if they do. But this door, not the fresco, not the niche, not the training passage that sanded my shoulders, this door was cut for a lock that matched a key that had invited itself into my life. Invitations are never neutral. The one you ignore is also answered. There are memories I wear like vestments. This is not one of them. This is skin. When I think of that moment, I do not see myself as I later wrote myself in my notes, careful, dutiful, well-meaning, and therefore absolved. I see a man of a certain age, not old, not young, who has learned to move with the confidence of someone who believes his motives are made of glass. He puts metal into absence and calls it stewardship. His mouth is dry. His tongue remembers the taste of ash after certain ceremonies. He anticipates a kind of light that will be more precise than brightness. The key went in as if the lock had been resting for it, a muscle that relaxes only when its missing counterpart returns. The wards resisted, like teeth that had clenched through a decade of bad dreams. I turned once, and something loosened in the building. I turned twice, and felt a patience end. I turned a third time, not because I had to. The door would have accepted me after two. I did it because completeness is also a superstition, and men like me collect those. When the official ones grow thin, the latch withdrew with the modesty of old mechanisms. The seam became a line, then a slit, then a margin wide enough to slip a breath through. The air that came out did not rush. It was not eager to meet me. It expanded with the reluctance of someone called by a name he has not heard in years. A fine veil of dust lifted, turned in the little wind my life made, and decided to settle elsewhere, as if my arrival had complicated its plans. I felt one grain land at the corner of my eye, and refused to blink. Tears are a language stones do not read. On the far side lay the gradient most people call darkness, but it is not a single color. It is a study in the absence of excuses. I raised my lamp the way the faithful raise candles, politely, not to insult whatever shares the room. The light pushed a little way in and then looked back at me for permission to proceed. I found the word please in my mouth without meaning to. I said it. Yes, to wood and air and what had waited. I said please. A courtesy cannot hurt you, even if no one is there to be honored by it. Especially then, you might expect revelation to be loud, for some engine to start in the bowels of the earth, for pipes to moan, or the saint on the nearest wall to roll his eyes at my intrusion. What I got was a hum so low I could have mistaken it for my own blood. I stilled my wrist to see if the hum would keep its pitch, and it did. The room wasn't sounding, I was. Down there, bodies act like tuning forks. We ring when no one calls us, and it is hard to say if that sound is bravery or warning. In my life, I have confused those two, often enough to suspect they are brothers who borrow each other's coats. There was a table just inside, built to the square proportions that come from geometry rather than taste. On it lay a cloth with a border of stitched angels, their wings notched wrong, as if to fly they would have to remember a pattern our eyes do not know. I touched the edge and felt oil, not the sacramental kind, but the slow animal residue of hands and centuries. Beneath the cloth was not wood but stone, and the stone had grooves cut into it running longitudinally, as if something wet had been channeled often enough to require plumbing. I flatter myself with that euphemism. The stone remembered. It was designed to remember. Beyond the table, the floor shifted from tile to packed earth without transition, and lines had been drawn in that earth with something not unlike a nail. Circles, yes, but also spirals that refused to center anywhere a human would find comfortable. In the far corner, in a rack that did not pretend to be a rack, iron hooks held objects wrapped in faded burlap. One shape made the simplest sense, a book in chains. The rest were humbler, a common hammer, a child's slate, a set of ordinary tongs. I catalogued them aloud by reflex, and my own voice startled me. It's calm, the calm of a doctor explaining to a family what happens next, when what happens next has already begun. I knew, even as my mouth shaped the inventory, that speaking slowly would be mistaken by history for mercy. I knew that some rooms are made to keep you from calling what you see by the names that would bring consequences. The lamp popped, one blue bubble of flame at the wick, and steadied. I took it as a reprimand. I tightened my hand on the handle and stepped farther in. Everything in me wanted to ask permission from someone I could not imagine. So I built the question the way a builder lays a foundation, level by level. May I look? May I remember? May I tell? If you are accustomed to prayer, those words sit easily in your mouth. I added one more I had never been taught. May I refuse? It felt like taking off a ring and setting it down on a smooth table, knowing someone will notice the pale circle left behind. You will ask what I found beyond the knot table, beyond the hooks and the burlap shapes that had trained themselves into humility, beyond the spirals that tried to teach my eyes how to be lost. I will tell you, but not yet. Chapter is a word like corridor. It leads. The promise I make you in this first telling is smaller and more dangerous than revelation. It is the promise to keep describing until the shapes do not need the lamp. I will keep my voice low. I will go without shoes. I will open every door I can without making the building fall. I will keep count in the dark when counting is the only prayer that can stand. Listen to the hum under my words. That is the building remembering me. Or it is me remembering what the building did to my breath. Either way, the door that was never meant to open is open. If you have a candle, shield it. If you have a question, do not yet sharpen it into accusation. Carrying a blade in here will teach the air to cut back. If you have only your attention, that will suffice. Attention is a key with a longer history than iron. I took one more step, and the floor answered with a sound like a book deciding to close and then changing its mind. I waited, because waiting is sometimes the bravest movement, a stillness that instructs what waits to meet you halfway. The lamp made a small aureole on the earth, where my foot would go next. I put my foot there not as a conqueror, not as a thief, not as a priest. I put it there as a witness who has finally remembered that a witness is not a window. A witness is a door, and now, with my hand on the lamp and my other hand open, palm empty of ring and coin and excuse, I will tell you what the first shelf held, what the grooved stone once carried, what the iron hooks refused to name, and how the key that found me taught me the first sentence of a language I had been trained all my life to forget. But before that, hear this. I am sorry for what I did with the gentleness they taught me. It was a soft hammer. It left no marks they could be compelled to photograph. It is not mercy to erase a bruise quickly. It is a policy. So, let me begin again inside the beginning. The door is open. The hum continues. My breath is mine. The room does not yet know my name, and I will not give it one. I am going to read to you what the room wrote in a script that has nothing to do with ink. I am going to show you how a table made of stone convinced the living to trust the dead. I am going to let the dust tell you what it learned each time a shoulder turned away just before the question could catch up. And when we are finished, when the lamp wavers and decides it is time for sleep to pretend to be knowledge, I will close nothing behind us. Doors can close themselves. Memory, if it is brave, stays ajar. The door had the courtesy to let me through, but the passage beyond had no such manners. It narrowed as if my intentions had girth, forcing me to shave them down with each step. The lamp's little halo clung to the stone, the way faith clings to habit, useful, comforting, and prone to sputter when the air forgets itself. I counted 7 breaths, and the wall on my right began to curve, not with the geometry of architects, but with the muscle memory of a river that once moved through here, in the shape of people carrying obligations. I pressed my fingers to the bend and felt indentations worn by rings. Bishop's rings, I thought, though vanity will carve the same grooves on a mason as it does on a prince of the church. The first chamber arrived the way a confession arrives. Suddenly, as if it had been waiting for me to run out of synonyms for stone. Chains greeted me dozens, then hundreds, stalling the lamp's light into links and shadow. They descended from rods blackened by the patience of iron, and at the end of each chain hung a book, hooded in leather, its cover stamped with sigils that pretended to be angels, but were anatomically incorrect. It is difficult to draw a creature you have never met. We draw our doctrine instead. The smell of the room was parchment after rain and beeswax after vespers, and the animal heat of words penned by men who thought to outlive themselves by binding their breath to calfskin. I passed a hand over the nearest tome and felt how the chain had taught the leather humility. Chains make decent catechists. They teach posture first. In the dim, the gilded titles surrendered their Latin with the reluctance of an elder, asked to speak of war. Index, Expurgatorius, Vetera Arcana, Formulae Angelicae. On one's spine, a small nail had been driven through the word decretum into the wood behind it, as if the judgment had been pinned to its own body. I pulled a book just far enough to see its first page. The chain allowed the movement, like a guard who permits a prisoner an extra step to scratch an itch. A table of letters met me, initials columned and crossed out, names once bright as stained glass now rubbed dull by the eraser ring's mercy. Besides certain entries, tiny marks like bites, I have seen mice make such edits. I have seen men do the same. Our teeth differ less than we like to pretend. It was then I heard the little cry of metal, a sound like two keys recognizing each other from a former life. I turned and found him, a monk whose beard had once been brown, then gray, then white, and had finally achieved the clear color of a resolved argument. He moved without surprise, like a bell that rings because a hand tugged precisely, not because heaven required it. He held a ring heavy with keys, each one different, each one carrying in its throat the dust of a room it believed itself to serve. He did not ask my name. He would have considered that an intimacy best left to the upstairs world, where introductions protect us from speaking plainly. He only inclined his head, which is the same gesture we use for consent and for warning. "You have the guest key," he said, in a voice sanded down by correct speech. "It unlocks what would rather be remembered than found." "I don't mean to trespass," I said. An old lie. Trespass is the only honest verb for curiosity. He nodded again, as if I had answered a different question. "The chains are kind," he said, and he lifted one to show me. "They don't confine the books. They confine the readers to the page at hand." He moved his hand along the chain as a man might smooth the flank of a wary horse. "You see the angel wings stamped wrong? Their reversed feather barbs cut against their natural lay. It keeps flight theoretical. Theory is the safest place for wings. To endice." He turned, and like a patient river he led me deeper. The chords of the chains thrummed behind us. Books gossip in their own way. The corridor narrowed again, then widened abruptly into a room with a table that wasn't a table, a slab with grooves that ran away from me in tidy little rivers. On hooks above it hung instruments with no innocence left. Tongs whose tips were padded with linen, tiny hammers, brushes made from hair that had refused to curl. The brushes smelled faintly of vinegar and ink, and a herb I could not name, but that every sacristy keeps a jar of, just in case a hymn needs to be persuaded to behave. "The reliquary forge," the monk said, with no triumph, "where inconvenient sentences learn to be footnotes, and footnotes learn to be lost." He taught me by touching things very little. He would lift a tool by its least assertive edge, show me how its weight was honest, then set it down as if it had asked to be excused early from a lecture. He picked up a ring silver, its bezel crusted with a blue that was not gemstone but powdered lapis, wedded to salt and a binder the novices called lacrima. He pressed the ring's face to a practice sheet, whispered something a chemist would call instruction and a congregant would call prayer, and when he lifted the ring, the black sentence beneath had grown pale at the edges, like a bruise beginning to forgive. "Eraser relics," he said. "Not a miracle. A kindness presented as one. The effect is gentler than scraping a line with a knife. Gentleness sells." It occurred to me that gentleness is the most effective cloak for violence, because it leaves the victim grateful. I said nothing. My gratitude is old and poorly trained. We moved on. The next door breathed cool and opened toward a cartographer's conscience. Maps lay on slanted boards, veined with repairs. Between layers of vellum, you could see older coastlines, older names, a city called by its river rather than by its ruler, a peninsula drawn fatter, as if the sea had once liked it less. In the lamplight, the boards shone with the shine that fingertips give to surfaces when decades of intent have been pressed there. A brass compass slept beside a bowl of sand the color of tired honey. A frame on the wall held a map so often overwritten that the ink had blue shadowed through its own thickness. Islands appeared as mildew might, shy, then confident, then gone. Pilgrim corridors, the monk said. He was not looking at the maps but at my eyes, registering whether they found reassurance or vertigo. From gate to chapel, from fountain to step to relic to exit, there is mercy in telling the faithful precisely where to walk. They don't trip over the questions we forgot to move out of the way. He pointed with a nail-cracked finger to a faint diagonal that cut through the formal routes like a rumor. That's a procession we don't schedule anymore. The saints in those niches were revised. We repainted the walls. Still, feet remember shortcuts. Our job is to keep the shortcut unlearned. I thought of the child who would later ask me about a vanished feast day and of her grandmother's candle. At the time, I only nodded as if my head belonged to the building. On a side table lay a bundle of faded ribbons, each tagged with a name and a date and a word that seemed to hover between removed and returned. I lifted one ribbon and nearly felt a pulse. Perhaps it was mine. The tag read, Sancta Pelagia Procession Route Rerouted, Hymn Transposed, Day Corrected. Corrected is a lovely verb. It carries a ruler in its pocket. The old man offered a courtesy he had not yet offered. He gave me his name, Brother Matteo. Simple, useful, like a spoon. A spoon feeds, a spoon takes, a spoon keeps its shape. He gestured, and we climbed down a further set of steps that had been burnished by decisions, not by feet. The spiral bent left, then left again, then accused me by bending left a third time. A door waited with no keyhole. Brother Matteo tapped 3 times on the jamb, in a rhythm infants recognize. The wood remembered the rhythm and stood aside. Inside, a disk of metal like a shield lay on a stand. The stand shaped to cradle a roundness that had been worshipped in other cultures for far more honest reasons. The disk was engraved with constellations, not as the sky offers them, but as policy prefers. Lines drawn where political convenience required, stars omitted where they would complicate supply lines, mythic animals bent into heraldic postures. Around the rim, hours were replaced by signs, and the pointer's tip was an arrowhead of bone. The device was a clock, only in the sense that a prison schedule is a calendar. The star clock, Brother Matteo said. His voice did not drop. It had reached bottom some time ago. It does not tell you when you are. It tells you when it is safer for certain things to happen. I put my palm close enough to feel the metal's indifferent temperature. Who winds it? Winding is a metaphor we use for the people above, he said. Here, the sky winds us. We decide what to pretend to notice. He lifted the bone pointer with 2 fingers and let it fall into a notch shaped like a crescent, tilted the wrong way. I felt the subtle click in my teeth. Somewhere behind the wall, something unlatched. A breath, a promise, a trap I would walk into with great deliberation later. Tonight, it was only sound surrounded by stone. You'll want to see the saints, Brother Matteo said, a sentence that would be considered pious upstairs but was a warning down here. He led me into a side chapel narrower than obligation, where on the lateral wall a ledger was mounted like a reliquary. Columns of names, column after column. My lamp's flame turned the ink to velvet. Each name bore a circle to its left, bright if the saint was permitted to be seen, darkened if the saint had been put to bed. At the far right of each line, a set of boxes, smaller circles marked procession, hymn, feast, relic. Some were filled, some crossed through, some left to answer later. I trailed a finger down the glass, following names that had walked me through childhood: Lucy, Agnes, Catherine, a George whose dragon had been given a different job in each generation. Whole rows had been washed into softness by the application of the eraser ring. When I breathed, my breath fogged the glass, as if the ledger were embarrassed. "They are not punished," Brother Matteo said, and for the first time in hours he sounded tired in the mortal way, not in the way of old objects. "They are reorganized." My honesty failed me then, and I asked the true question with a false tone. "By what authority?" He tilted his head, as if I had asked about gravity. "By the only kind that endures," he said. "Convenience dressed as concern." I looked again at the names and saw, tucked into a corner as gently as a grandmother tucks a child into a fresh bed, a list of papal editions, the same name repeating, numbers altering, dates shifted like furniture until the room looked the same, but the walk between chair and door took longer. I felt the floor tilt and the blood in my ears protest. The lamp guttered, and Brother Matteo steadied it with a practiced shake. I realized he had been timing our steps to the lamp's needs, the way a nurse times questions to a patient's pain. We returned for breath, more than for light, to the reliquary forge. He set a small dish on the stone and poured a measure of salted wine into it. He pricked his finger without flinching and let one drop fall, then another. The wine sighed, a sound like a page agreed upon. He slid the dish across to me. "Scribe's finger," he said. "Ink finds us." I touched my own finger to the rim and tasted metal and winter grapes and the shy cruelty of salt. Somewhere my blood introduced itself to the idea of permanence and decided to try for it. "Tell me," I asked him, "what happens when a name refuses to be reorganized? When a map insists upon its old coastlines? When a constellation refuses reassignment? Then we adjust the walking," he said. "If a truth cannot be moved, we move the people around it. A festival becomes private. A private grief becomes picturesque. A picturesque habit becomes a watermark under a new painting. We are very good at watermarks." He motioned, and we walked a corridor where the walls had been written upon and scraped clean and written upon again. Scrape marks made their own script, a language whose alphabet is regret. In a niche sat a narrow cabinet with shallow drawers. He slid one out to show me strips of music, each bearing a few measures copied in a hand trained to obey, the notes coded where the popular ear would not be taught to hear them. "When we forbid an interval," he said, "we keep it. We hide maps inside the wrong chords." We passed a door sucked shut by the vacuum of long disuse. "That leads to the practice cells," he said. "Not for instruments, for voices." He did not open it. "You can erase a sentence. It is harder to erase how the sentence sounded in the mouth that first dared it." And then, as if even stone must vary its diet, the corridor widened into a workshop that smelled of distilled copper and humility, glassware married to liturgy, flasks stoppered by wax, marked with crosses impressed from rings. On a shelf, a compass whose needle had renounced the earth and pledged itself to Rome. A vial of bright water, labeled in a careful hand, Lacrima Seraphim, which, under a lens, would confess itself to be a chemistry the upstairs world would forgive, because the label was honest in its direction, if not in its composition. On a rack lay a shroud with tiny rows of stitches in 2 shades of thread, one the color of dust, one the color of insistence. Under lamplight, the stitches became letters, if you knew which angle to stand at. The letters spelled a supply route, masked as sanctity. Science is impatient, Brother Matteo said. It wants verbs, we give it nouns, and it rests. This is Exapolis. I touched the glass of a case with 2 fingers, so the prince would make a little gate, and saw, beyond them, a lens ground to an impossible thinness, edged with a ring of beaten silver, inscribed, Spear of Sight. I felt a sympathy for the lens that surprised me. Objects that see are always overworked. Who decides which room a discovery will become? I asked. The ones who know how fear travels, he said. They seat fear on a comfortable chair and let it tell them where it would like to visit next. The lamp's flame tilted, then righted itself, as if it too preferred sitting to standing. I leaned back against the cool of the wall and counted slowly, buying my own breath in coin I had been hoarding since the fresco. I told myself to inventory, to observe, to be that calm man whose notes would later look like a map anyone could follow. But my hands betrayed me and interlaced, the way hands do when they are trying to put a fence around whatever is rattling inside the chest. We came at last to a stair that didn't announce itself, only offered a change in texture, stone to a grit that could have been ground bone or could have been patience powdered so that it might fit in a smaller jar. Brother Matteo paused, sniffed the air as a man will sniff a soup he has supervised since dawn, and said, "The hour is not yet for the lower gate." He gestured back toward the maps, the chains, the ledger, the forge. These will be enough for now. The rest is hungry. Thanks for watching. I should have been angry at being turned aside. Anger is a good human way to hide relief. Instead, I felt something I had not felt since the night oil first made my scalp smell like a holy decision. I felt chosen by the room for the size of my ignorance. The room had measured me and found me exactly unready. It is a mercy to be found unready by things that would eat you if you lied to them about your appetite. Brother Matteo rested his hand briefly on my shoulder, a weight as factual as bread. "There is a name for what you are doing," he said. "You call it looking. We call it remembering. Not remembering as in recollection. Remembering as in reattaching limbs. The body of history has been disassembled to fit into a smaller box. We put the parts back on when the moon permits us to work unsupervised." He moved away then, as if that sentence required distance to settle. The keys on his ring gave a small, embarrassed clink. A moth, not the one from the black basin, a cousin perhaps, made its way to the margin of the lamp's light and considered whether to immolate for knowledge. The moth decided to wait. Wisdom also sometimes waits. We returned through the corridor of trained stone, the lamp reciting its short creed on the walls. I touched one chain as we passed, and it answered with a polite tremor. I do not know why I apologized to the book that trembled, perhaps because apology is the right language for any room where words have been forced to live, attached to iron. At the threshold of the fresco, the night above had shifted, trading its earlier hush for the kind of quiet in which a bell nearby has been warned not to ring. Brother Matteo stopped beside the seam where paint met stone and, with the heel of his hand, pressed the plaster back into a truer seam, the way a mother pushes a lock of hair back from a child's eyes. "You'll return," he said. The sentence accepted no answer. "When the pointer favors you." "The star clock decides?" I asked. "The star clock encourages," he said, and for the first and only time offered a smile not borrowed from duty. It made him look briefly like a man who had once laughed in the wrong place and had not been punished severely enough to cure him. I stepped through the narrow and stood in the corridor where normal time goes to dress itself for the public. In the vestry beyond, the usual linen lay folded into the correct shapes, and the water in the copper ewer reflected my face with more generosity than I deserved. I listened for the hum, and heard only blood in a body that still agreed to carry me. As I closed the fresco, a flake of paint the size of a fingernail came loose and held for a second to the cuff of my sleeve. It was the blue the painters reserve for heaven when donors have been generous. I lifted it. It cracked in my palm, and powdered heaven dusted the lifeline of my hand. I could have kissed it. Instead, I blew, and the powder did what the powder of heaven always does. It chose its own direction. On the way out, I passed a window whose glass had been thickened by centuries to the point where straight lines outside turned into supplicants. Rome leaned, and then leaned back. My reflection behind the leaning city looked older than the name I had borrowed from a bishop's ledger. I thought of the chains. I thought of the grooves in the stone table, that patient plumbing, and of the blue at the edge of the eraser ring. I thought of remembering, and of limbs that must learn to belong again. Upstairs, the nave accepted me without commentary. Candles kept their arithmetic. A tourist coughed the cough of someone who will later wonder whether he was ever here at all. I walked along the prescribed pilgrim corridor, then stepped aside, very slightly, precisely where the old map had shown a diagonal. The floor did not punish me. It remembered how to carry such steps. When I reached the north transept, the archivist Cavebird exact stood where I would have placed him if I had been allowed to write the scene. He regarded my empty hands and the dust on my cuff as if both were hymns in keys, not recommended for mourning. "Found what you were misled to look for?" he asked. "Only what was prepared," I said. He nodded and resumed the math of his duties. I resumed the math of mine, which had recently learned to include fractions of honesty. In my pocket, the guest key lay quiet, chuckling in iron at the thought that a door is only a beginning with excellent public relations. I slept poorly that morning. Sleep avoided me like a child avoids a bath that will wash off the smell of a good day's dirt. When I did fall under, I dreamed a room full of clocks with no faces, ticking only with the weight of their pendulums, and a monk counting, not the ticks, but the moments between, as if the space were the thing that mattered. When I woke, the light in my cell had found the exact color of prayers that are spoken for show. I dressed with due regard for scandal, and went where the door had been, and the hour for once favored me. The star clock had decided to encourage, but that belongs to the next confession. For now let me end with a small truth that seems harmless, and is therefore easy to smuggle past the guards we have installed in ourselves. Books do not resent chains. People do. When you feel the resentment rise, not loud, not heroic, just the steady ache a wrist feels when freed from a bracelet worn too long, do not treat it as sin. Treat it as circulation returning. It will tingle. It will hurt. Then, like a corridor that remembers a diagonal, It will teach your steps a route no map upstairs dares to draw. The room had waited so long, it had learned not to wait. When Brother Matteo lifted the bar, the door accepted the movement the way a scar accepts weather without protest, without hope. We entered a chamber taller than any honesty I had managed so far in my life. Shelves climbed until they stopped pretending to be furniture and became ladders for dust. At the center stood a book that did not sit on the table. The table knelt beneath it. The lectern was built from oak so old it had forgotten forests. On the spine of the book, in letters that had once been bright and were now the color of breath held too long, a title, Chronicon Phantasma. I spoke it and heard my mouth add a syllable of caution all by itself. The chronicle was bound in boards wider than a man's chest and laced shut with thongs that had outlived several centuries of persuaders. It was not the size that humbled me. Cathedrals love their enormities. It was the thickness, as if each layer of vellum had gained weight by eating the layer beneath. Brother Matteo loosened the laces with the mild patience of someone unwrapping a child from winter. He did not look at me. The face you make when you open certain things is a face you do not lend to witnesses. When the book yawned, the room thinned. I smelled lime and animal skin and the perfume of ink ground to shine in a mortar that had heard, over decades, all the prayers men say when they are complicit and want the ink to make them clean. The first folio did not begin with a date, but with a prayer to dates to behave. The hand was confident without cruelty, that professional ease scribes acquire when they agree to let their knuckles ache in service of something larger than themselves and somehow more fragile. The lines were ruled so straight you could have used them to judge a sword's edge. The entries were not years stacked on years. They were decisions pretending to be recollection. Here a winter elongated to hide a famine by spreading it thin. There a rain extended, the way a rumor is extended with embellishment that no longer knows it is embellishment. I touched the corner of a page, and the vellum answered with the soft resistance of muscle under skin. On certain lines the ink had a grayer sheen, a fog where sentences had been attenuated by the blue ring Matteo had shown me upstairs. Those lines looked like bones cured for display. "Read where the ink doesn't want to," he said. I read the margins. That is where the body keeps its scars. A note in a smaller hand. A just feast to new equinox. Memory will follow the bell. Another, crueler for its discretion. Remove name from litany. Family relocated. Provide substitute miracle. The substitutes were practical. A lamp would smoke in just the right way. A spring would run sweet for a week. A physician's useful habit would be called piety, and therefore quietly funded. When genius refused the costume, silence was tailored instead. I turned a leaf and felt the heft increase, as if a century had climbed onto the page while we weren't looking. Dates came in sequences that agreed with the sky until they didn't. Then the sky was asked to be gentlemanly about it. Here the calendar leaned. There it righted itself. The way an honest man leans when a lie needs just a little help to look plausible across a room. The adjustment was named correction, and corrections, like patience, acquire halos if enough men put them into minutes with a steady hand. "It looks like astronomy," I said. "It tastes like politics," Brother Matteo answered. A column down the left margin bore small circles, some bright, some dim, some cross-hatched with a scribe's pity. At the far right, paired columns, Annalise, Populus, Ecclesia, Ars, history, people, church, art, each entry to be touched according to the graded necessity of agreement. If a century needed moving, you moved first the processions, then the hymns, then the ledgers of taxes and vows, finally the paintings, because paint does not argue except with light. There was a page where a whole year had been replaced with the phrase Silentio pro concordia, silence for the sake of unity. It read like a blanket laid over a restless child. I put my finger on the line and felt nothing, as if the vellum were ashamed to host so little. Think of everything that fits inside silence. Births unrecorded, debts forgiven or unforgiven by no one, kisses that never have a feast day to shimmer against. I thought of anniversaries and funerals, and the calendar's steady work of giving grief a spine to stand against. Remove the spine and grief slumps and calls it humility. They didn't delete, Matteo said, correctly hearing my accusation before I spoke it. They misfiled. Misfiled is tidier. You don't lose the thing. You lose the ability to find it when you need it. He turned to a folio whose bottom edge had been darkened not by fingers but by candles held too near, as if heat were a kind of punctuation. This page was titled De Editionibus Pontificum. Beneath the title, the same papal name repeated with small alterations of number, the intervals of service braided to cross stubborn gaps. It would not look wrong to the public record. Nothing here looks wrong to the public record. It would feel right to a procession because the music had been transposed to accommodate the choir's convenience. The choir would sing and believe itself faithful. They were, to the arrangement, not to the melody. I wanted to be angry at names and rings and the habit of men to behave like years are chess pieces. Instead, I felt tired in the way of a man who recognizes in the mechanism his own smaller vices writ large. I had corrected a date here, softened a judgment there, filed a complaint under the wrong heading because the right one would have started a fight the room was too small to hold. The Chronicle was a stadium version of my desk. Matteo guided my finger. He did not touch me, but the air between us adopted his intention to a column of little icon drawings in the margin. Candles, ladders, boats, bulls. He recited, as if reminding himself of an alphabet. Candles for feasts, ladders for processions that ascend or descend a rank, boats for departures we don't want recorded as departures, bulls for bulls. His mouth thinned to a line I could have mistaken for humor. You may add a star when you invent a constellation. Invent? Constellations are agreements about proximity. We are very good at those. His ovinde, tu had den. He turned pages faster, then slower, according to tides only he could feel. We paused at a section whose script had been layered, a palimpsest whose underwriting glowed through the new text like old city lights under fog. The top hand described a winter of illness made to sound orderly. The bottom hand, an uncombed parade of pains. A baker whose fingers healed crooked and therefore changed the taste of bread in a quarter of the city. A midwife exiled to a village where twins were born for the first time anyone could remember. A scholar whose manuscript on star parallax brought pigeons to his window at odd hours and soldiers to his door at dawn. In the margin, a tiny line connected the scholar to a hymn, the hymn to a parade route, the parade route to a saint whose day had been moved from summer to late spring, where thunder seldom dared to interrupt. The web was elegant. It would have made a mathematician proud or sick, depending on his appetite that day for beautiful cruelties. I asked, not gently, "Who writes this?" Those who grew tired of watching the world bruise itself by accident, he said. We supply accidents that do less damage in the places that matter. Which places matter? The ones with ledgers. He met my eyes. He was not being cruel. He was telling me what the world had taught him, and what he had taught me by letting me in here. Rooms like this do not radicalize men. They simply make explicit the agreements the rest of us have made with our laziness. He turned to a slimmer choir sewn in later. Its vellum was younger, its edges less chewed by time. This section bore a different discipline. Columns that compared calendars, Julian to Gregorian, to a third that had no public name, only a glyph of a hand, turning a ring on a finger already raw. The third calendar was not a proposal. It was an internal reality. The notations read like a war diary between minutes and mandates. On certain days, a small mark, a crescent with its horns facing down, indicated that time had been made to bow. Meetings moved, ships delayed, a pope's cough made to harmonize with a bell, to convince the city the hour had changed. It is easier to move a man than the sun. It is easiest to move the sense a man has of sun. You can't adjust the heavens, I said. You can adjust what counts as sunrise, he replied. And if the city lights its candles a breath earlier for a season, the memory of dawn shifts by a finger's width. After a generation, the finger is a hand. We reached a calfskin leaf so heavy it must have been a rappel entreaty flattened by a patient stone for a year. Across its face ran a single line of text, wide and long and cruelly tidy. Centuria quae non fuit, the century that was not. Below, in red, smaller and angrier, nolite loqui de ista, do not speak of this. The red had bled slightly into the surrounding fibers, the way anger bleeds into the white of an eye. The edges of the page had been burned, just enough to remind anyone touching it that fire is available and willing. Why? I asked, and heard the priest in me beg the answer to be theological. To keep a war from winning, he said. Sometimes you cannot stop a war. You can only defeat its memory. A century can be mislaid so that its causes forget where to report for duty in the next generation. You make space. Space is mercy when you've run out of forgiveness. What happens to births, to vows, to debts? What happens to a whisper in a bell tower when the bells are rung? He made the smallest gesture of apology a man can make without attracting attention. It is not nothing. It is not enough. He turned the page with 2 fingers, as if lifting a lid off a fever. The next folio was a ledger of names, but not saints this time. Falsi pontifices. The heading called them false pontiffs. I flinched, then read and understood. The men were not impostors who had climbed onto thrones with counterfeit rings. They were additions names, revised to stitch the cloth. Dates exchanged the way one exchanges candles on an altar when the wax burns wrong. The hand here was particularly polite. The cruelty of editing is that it requires impeccable manners. A line connected one of these to an edict that had moved Easter by a whisper in a year when the harvest had failed early and the city needed a public reason to forgive itself for not feasting. Another line connected a name to a donation of pigments expensive enough to repaint a chapel ceiling with heaven the exact color of tolerated despair. A third line connected no line at all. It went off the edge and disappeared into the wood of the lectern. I put my finger on that line and, very childishly, wished to follow it into a crack where paper cannot go. "Do you hear it?" Matteo asked. I listened. The hum was there again, low and even, as if the chronicle itself had a throat with a note it refused to change. Yes. He. It deepens when a reader understands instead of only reading. He tilted his head. The book is not alive. You are. It borrows your blood to remind you of that. There is spirity for one. Dus. We stood with it a long time, and time minded us accordingly. The lamp's flame shortened with the quiet despair of useful things asked to be useful again. I imagined the men who had stood in this spot, how they had come with their own keys and been admitted, and had listened to the hum, and had made their agreements with it. There are men who hear a note and think it is command. There are others who hear it as warning. I had been trained to hear everything as instruction. It is what makes obedience so efficient. Brother Matteo took up a stylus and, on a scrap kept precisely for such demonstrations, wrote a date in the old style, then another in the new, then a third that belonged to neither and both. He dipped the blue ring into a tiny dish, pressed it once to the third date, and the ink softened like bread in broth. The numbers blurred at their edges, and then accepted a new shape spoken by his breath. He did not change them into what they had been. He changed them into what the chronicle required for a different set of people not to starve. I could argue with the method. I could not argue with the milk that reached a child, because a date had been persuaded to be somewhere else. There, he said, not triumphant, not ashamed. It is not always wicked to move a landmark if people keep breaking themselves against it. The wickedness arrives when you begin to love the moving. And do you? I love order, he said softly, and I hate messes we make in the name of God. The chronicle is both, like me. He closed his eyes briefly, an old habit of a man checking whether his interior compass still points to whatever it called north when he was young. I turned a final folio in this sitting, because I felt if I asked more of the book, it would ask something back I was not ready to give. The page was a map, but not of land. It diagrammed memory, as if memory were a city. Avenues named for saints and sins, cul-de-sacs of likely to be believed, plazas where festivals could be relocated without spilling over into riots, rivers of rumor with carefully constructed bridges labeled miracle, minor, scandal, contain, apology, condicial. Along the bottom ran a legend in tiny script. If a district floods, open this gate, move a feast, move a relic, move a grave. There was an icon for grandmother. The icon indicated pressure points the system had learned to respect. The note beside it read, "Grandmothers cannot be legislated. Provide candles, do not confiscate." I laughed. A single unholy bark. Matteo allowed it. They beat us more often than not, he said. Grandmothers are the archive's competition. We closed the book, not to hide it, but to stop it from continuing to think with our blood. The laces settled with a sigh. I pretended the leather made on purpose. He set the bar across the lectern, a gesture less like locking and more like tucking in. The hum softened, or my pulse remembered other duties. I found, on the table beside the chronicle, a small knife of bone for lifting corners. I lifted nothing. I set the knife down and realized my hand shook a little, not with fear or righteousness, but with the tremor of a man who has been given an instrument he might one day misuse if he convinces himself he uses it for mercy. On the way out, we paused at a narrow shelf that carried what looked at first glance like a row of sermons bound without love. The spines bore simple dates, no titles. Witness rolls, Matteo said. written by custodians who did not have the rank to be heard upstairs. We pretend to ignore them. We do not. He pulled one and opened to a page where a sacristan had recorded the way the city's cats went mad 3 nights in a row, and how, on the 4th, the bells refused to ring even when pulled. The entry ended with a note. Therefore, move the procession of Saint Bibiana. The cats belong more to her night than to the carpenter's. That is ridiculous, I said, meaning it respectfully. It is brilliant, he corrected. Ridiculous is sometimes what intelligence looks like when it forgets to flatter itself. He slid the roll back, and we returned to the Hall of Chains, where the books hung in their polite captivity. I understood now, more than I had an hour before, how kindness can be a gate. The chains did not bind knowledge. They trained the reader to stand still long enough for the page to finish its work. I put my hand around one chain and felt the faint warmth metal keeps from air. I let go before it could teach my skin a shape. At the threshold, he touched my sleeve, not a grasp, a liturgical brush. You know now what must be known to survive the lower rooms, he said. You saw the ledger where anniversaries are taught to disappear. You saw the calendar taught to bow. You saw what order looks like when it forgets to apologize. And I saw what I look like when I stop pretending I am not part of it, I said. He almost smiled again. Good. The ones who think themselves visitors do the most harm. We climbed, and the steps reacted with the satisfaction stairs have when they are used by people who do not lie to them about weight. At the black glass basin, the coin remained, patient as obligation. The moth was gone. I hoped for a window. There was none. Not every release is airborne. At the fresco, I hesitated. The angel's hand had not moved in the hours below, though its gesture owned the room as effectively as any lock. I pressed the plaster back, and it accepted my one good deception, that I would not return. Matteo heard the deception and did not argue. The blood moon will make its invitation, he said. You will decide whom you want more truth or your sleep. I passed into the public corridors where candles untroubled by ledgers burned with the honest physics of melting. I walked past a woman whose scarf had been tied to cover a throat, in which a cry would not be welcome, and a man whose shoes had learned to echo only on alternate stones. The city did what cities do. It performed being a city, and behind the performance, rooms arranged caution into liturgy. Back in my cell, I laid the key on the table and watched it not move. Iron does not gloat. It knows time by tasting air and growing darker where fingers touch without thinking. I set beside it a scrap of paper and wrote, not what I had seen, the chronicle would not endure being copied, but what the hum had sounded like in my head. I wrote, a note lower than confession, higher than command. Then I crossed it out, not with the ring, with a pencil, because mercy is sometimes cheaper and therefore more likely to be honest. That night I dreamed of anniversaries looking for their dates the way exiles look for their houses, in cities renamed by conquerors, polite enough to keep the streets, but not the gestures that belong on them. In the dream I told a grieving woman the church had mislaid her day. She forgave me and lit a candle anyway. The candle burned with a flame that disagreed slightly with the room and agreed exactly with her grandmother's hand. When I woke, the color of morning was the administrative beige of decisions that believe themselves kind. I rose, dressed, and told myself I would not go back before the moon bled. I lied, of course. You cannot show a man the ledger where time is taught how to walk and expect him to keep his feet on the same road. I am saying this plainly, so that when you follow me you will not pretend like I did that your motives are nobler than the room's appetite. The Chronicle had not finished its reading of me. I had not finished my reading of it. Between those two hung the star clock's bone pointer, the city, and a bowl of salted wine, where a scribe's finger stains history with enough honesty to make arson unnecessary. Outside, on the square, a child counted pigeons and kept losing track, because pigeons insist upon being alive. Her mother corrected gently, no blue ring, no chronicle, just a hand on a small shoulder guiding a number back to its place. I watched them measure a morning the chronicle would pretend not to notice. It was good to see a calendar obey a laugh. It would not be good enough for long. Down below, where pages weigh more than months, the Chronicon Phantasma waited rehearsing its hum. I gave my pulse the day to prepare. Then I took the key, which had grown a little heavier with the kind of honesty one learns only after one has disobeyed in the correct direction, and I went to find the door again, to ask it what the next page required of a man who had finally admitted that his gentleness was a tool others had put in his hand and called virtue. The door into the workshop didn't open. It conceded. A hinge groaned with the courtesy of old obedience, and a draught slid past me with a scent like rain that had been taught Latin. Glass and copper answered the lamp before stone did thin throats of alembics, the proud shoulders of retorts and receivers, the tidy hips of vials stoppered with wax impressed by rings. Every surface had learned to glow modestly. It is hard to lie in a room that reflects you from so many angles, so the trick is to rename the angles. Brother Matteo paused the way a choir pauses between Kyrie and Christ. Not quite silence, not quite sound. This, he said, is where verbs become nouns. He meant, discovery becomes relic, inquiry becomes reliquary, experiment becomes exemplar. He meant, movement is dangerous, we encase it. A Jesuit was already there, back-bent with the precision of a man who had learned to put his spine into the habits of glass. He wore an apron salted white where solutions dried, and his sleeves held the ghostly outline of cuffs he had long ago stopped unfolding for supper. His face had the kind of kindness that results from exhaustion, choosing not to become cruelty. He did not look up when we entered. He let the room tell him we had arrived, and then answered the room. "You are late to the century," he said. "Do not fret. It will come around again if asked politely." He set down a pipette, drew off his glove with a practiced flick, and presented a small lens mounted in a hoop of beaten silver. Around the hoop, engraved in a hand that cared too much for legibility to be called beautiful, were the words Hasta Visionis, spear of sight. "A lens," he said to me, "becomes a spear when it threatens the wrong armor. We sheath it in a name." Then the spear and the armor dined together. He angled the lens toward a candle, and the wick jumped into a cathedral of itself, arched aisles, tiny transepts of carbon, a rude beam of stiffening ash. "If I write a letter about diffraction," he continued, "a bishop will sneeze. If I place this on the altar above a saint whose legend does not mind being seen through, a prince will kneel. Kneeling is a better funding model." On a side table lay a stack of certificates, each with a wax seal the color of berries crushed for festival. Matteo lifted one, Instrumentum Recognitum, Veronicae Velo Mechanicum, the mechanical veil of Veronica, authorized to multiply images without multiplying heresies. Beneath, a neatly itemized bill paper ink pigmented assurance. "We do not sell indulgences," the Jesuit said mildly. "We sell instructions for trust." I wandered the edges, the way a man circles a lake to make sure it is the same lake from every shore. Jars held powders with the innocent arrogance of spices, cinnabar and verdigris, lamp-black like the idea of night, ground lapis that remembered mountains, salt that remembered tears. A mortar wore its pestil's kisses, a scale waited with both pans lifted, impartial and lonely. On a shelf, a blistered coil of copper wound through a bath, green as old saints. It winked at me the way a secret winks when it has been wearing a cassock too long and wants to dance. "Galvanism," the Jesuit supplied, seeing my gaze. Or, upstairs, Street Eligius's gentle persuader for stubborn hearts. He smiled with only 2/3 of his mouth. "Wires will conquer us if we let them keep their names." One see you, on a bench. A painter's palette lay beside a saint's halo cut from gesso like a moon left to cool. A pattern of pinpricks dotted the circle, too regular to be pious chance, too reserved to be ostentation. The Jesuit lifted a sheet of vellum and overlaid it. The pricks aligned with a star map drawn mercilessly in ruled ink. Constellations tilted into a geometry that had nothing to do with shepherds and everything to do with logistics. "Under candlelight," he said, "supply routes appear to those who know to look. The halo is a syllabus. We don't keep secrets from God. We keep them from the kind of men who pray with their mouths and count with their knives." It's live and in tenor. He took up a tiny brush, dampened it in a vial that smelled like vinegar, teaching itself patience, and stroked the halo's rim. The gilding was too perfect until it wasn't. In the new softness, a line became a path. I saw where cassocks would go while cities slept, where parchment and bread and the right names would pass under the noses of men who had been trained to watch the wrong doors. "It is not forgery," he said. "It is emphasis. We do not lie. We select." We moved to the music bench. There, thin strips of paper, like formal tongues, lay in rows. Notes drawn with a pen whose nib had studied how droplets want to round themselves. The Jesuit tapped a measure labeled tritone prohibitum ad usum privatum, the forbidden interval for private use. Between the tidy black notes were penciled letters notating meetings and minutes. "Tertius gratis, no lanterns, bring bread." In a margin, "If questioned, blame the organist." He handed me a tuning fork. When I struck it, the room changed by the width of a shiver. My bones took the note personally. "Codes," he said, "are best when the body is flattered into keeping them." Near the window, if a slit of glass greened by centuries of breath can be called a window, a chest held small blanks of bone wrapped in linen, tongues not yet given to relics. Another chest held silver bezels awaiting enamel, their faces scuffed by apprentices' fear. On the opposite wall, a press slouched like a giant ashamed of its appetite. Its bed was ink-stained. Its tympan wore a bandage of felt. A plate rested there, engraved with a saint raising a hand in a gesture somewhere between benediction and caution. "We print as little as possible," the Jesuit said, "but the times prefer paper to rumor. Paper makes more obedient mistakes." He led me to a cupboard with a lock of its own humility. Inside, labeled in the same clear hand as the lens, Lacrima Seraphim. The vial held nothing miraculous to the honest eye. Distilled copper salts and saline, a faintly bluish water that wanted to be believed. Upstairs, he said, it cures iron tongues' bells that have gone mute in damp weather. It also helps certain statues weep. Weeping is a public service when faith runs dry. I found myself hunting for blasphemy, as a greedy man hunts for crumbs after the feast. Every object refused to oblige. Each had a function named wrongly on purpose, a device to translate voltage into devotion, a pigment to turn a boundary into a border saintly enough to stop a riot, a paper to tell printers how not to panic when their type misbehaved toward doctrine. The miracle, I said at last, is that none of this is miraculous. The Jesuit's eyes warmed for a moment, a hearth remembering, precisely, we do not counterfeit heaven. We counterfeit the courage to face what is not heaven and call it manageable. If you give a populace a miracle, they rest. If you give them a mechanism named a miracle, they organize. Brother Matteo wandered to a rack, where coats of mail hung like habits with ambitions. The metal was stained, the color of figs dried under patience. On the inside, hems glistened threads of fine chain stitched with something not quite silver. Witch hunter coats, he said, not approving, not condemning. Worn on nights when rhetoric needs the help of fear. He lifted a hem to show me the stitching, angelic letters etched so that an officer might lift the coat by a line of praise as by a handle. I imagined hands pulling men back from doors they should not open. I imagined the letters blistering their palms. Who writes the homilies for these devices? I asked. Who decides how to tell the public the name that will keep the wires and powders from sounding like rebellion? The Jesuit riffled a drawer and produced pamphlet drafts on the proper reverence for the lens of Longinus, regarding the weeping of Veronica's veil and the admonitions thereof, concerning the music that stays within the sanctified steps of a scale. Margins bristled with edits. A line struck through. Never ascribe the wonder to the worker, a replacement. Always ascribe the wonder to the work. The worker is but the vessel. Lower. If the worker is too visible, give him a room downstairs and a title that keeps visitors out. He shrugged. We learned this when we burned people. Burning is an admission of rhetorical failure. He guided me to a narrow door I had mistaken for a seam. Inside, a corridor pinched until it felt like penance. The walls tapered, then tapered again, a geometry designed to transmute a man's width into agreement. The corridor of narrowing, he said. We do not torture here. We invite conclusions. On the far wall, a chair faced a blankness as honest as a closed mouth. A board lay across its arms, an obedient lap. A scholar sits. He reads his notes. He hears his own voice without echo. A mind's echo can make a man arrogant. We remove it. He touched the blank wall, and it answered with nothing, the most articulate reply in the building. Back in the workshop, an apprentice scurried past, carrying a bucket of brine with the reverence of a man carrying a sacrament and a mop. He glanced at me and looked away fast enough to keep me from being anyone. He set the bucket down by the slab of stone Matteo had warned me about upstairs, the table with grooves. A brush rested on its edge. Bristles stained a quiet gray that had once been sentences. Quenching ink, the Jesuit said gently. Never too much at once. Regret must be buffered. On the lintel, above the slab, someone had carved a motto in Latin whose grammar refused to be as pious as hoped. Miracula sunt disciplinae in vestimentis. Miracles are disciplines in clothing. The chisel had slipped at the last letter, and been corrected with the kind of neatness that teaches a mistake to serve the message. Who was he? I asked. A man we saved from himself, Matteo said. We gave him a cupboard and a ledger. He wanted bonfires. Some souls must be laced to a chair to learn how to use thread. It is a pace. We sat on stools that did not squeak. The Jesuit poured us each a thimble of wine, the color of decisions. It tasted of iron and obediences left overnight to soften. You are thinking of the Chronicle, he said. You are worried that the book and this room share a mother. They do, I said. Her name is Comfort. He nodded, pleased the word had arrived, dressed for the conversation. Comfort is not a sin, he said. But she is a gossip. She tells you you've done enough. She tells you the world will thank you if you make it easier to be afraid in the correct direction. Something in me broke and refused to be repaired cheaply. How many men have you turned into reliquaries? I asked. As few as we can, he said. The witch hunters prefer mending to burning. Mending leaves fewer stories. He set his empty thimble down with a click that made the glassware take notice. But understand, when the blood moon lifts the latch, the policy of comfort steps aside. The rite does not summon demons. It commissions narratives. In that commission, we are tempted to love neatness more than truth. The moon makes neatness feel holy. We cross to a case fitted with shallow drawers, each lined in blue felt, each holding something that might have been trivial if its label had not been so certain. Feather from the wing of the messenger, at Antioch, instrumental. Splinter from the gatepost at the first riot, contained by him, shard of window that taught a crowd to see. They are what they are, the Jesuit said. We do not pretend to make saints' bones. We keep the bones of events that behaved. He handed me a feather whose barbs had been combed against themselves until flight was theoretical. It smelled like dust. Hold it, he said, and remember everything you have been asked to forget. I tried. Memory came like a procession, taking a different street than expected and waving politely at the old one as it passed. At the far bench, he opened a ledger, not for saints, but for techniques. Under transubstantiations, practical, were entries like a spice index, how to rename a lens, when to baptize a wire, which pigments keep secrets, where to seed a rumor in a hymn. The recipes were spare and unromantic. A child could have followed them with disastrous accuracy. Why write these down? I asked. So they can be unlearned, he said. A thing must be brought into language to be brought to trial. And Sprend, the workshop's hum had a different pitch than the Chronicles, not lower, not higher, busier, like a hive that had taught itself to recite. I felt it in my teeth. I felt it in the blue marrow of my fingernails. The lamp, bored with its own usefulness, gave a small pop and corrected itself. In the corner, a stack of wooden crates labeled with parishes' names waited like polite soldiers. I watched dust write its own scripture on them. They had been stamped with routing marks that pretended to be saints' monograms. Routes were destiny here. The shortest distance between 2 points was never a straight line. It was an argument that had learned to smile. Come, Matteo said, voice dropping into a register the room respected. He led me to a curtain made of a fabric that had not originally meant to become a curtain. Its weight argued with its duty. We passed through to a chapel without windows, floor inlaid with a zodiac drawn backward. My stomach tipped like stepping onto a ship without permission. Only the pattern, he said, sensing me correct. No mass, no theatrics. The blood moon is not tonight. But the room kept its rehearsal. Hooks above the door held lacquered paper dragons with ash-dark eyes, the watchers' wings stilled, mouths set in the mild O of perpetual surprise. They were not ridiculous. Ridicule is how fear practices before the performance. On the ambo lay the book of names, not a martyr roll, not a heretic list, a catalogue of unquiet questions in human form. My name was not there. The names were precise and did not require adjectives to do harm. "We do not summon anything," Matteo said, and the Jesuit nodded as if the sentence were a creed that paid rent on its own. "We align a clock with a claim and authorize a story." He closed the book softly. "Stories are obedient for exactly as long as you feed them." He gestured, and we returned to the workshop, where the air, relieved, resumed its vocation of smelling like instructions. He took from a drawer a tiny stamp, its face engraved with a chiro so tired it had learned to look like comfort. He pressed it into the wax of a certificate and handed it to me. "Recognitum," recognized, not true, not false, seen, weighed, dressed properly. "You will need this upstairs," he said, "not for an object, for a person." "Who?" "Yourself," he said. "When you begin to name what you have seen, you will need to convince your own mouth not to panic. Authority is a tranquilizer when properly diluted." We stood a long time among the verbs being turned into nouns. I thought of a boy on a riverbank casting a line and calling it patience. I thought of a woman in a market calling a lie an estimate and handing over change. I thought of my hands baptizing ink in salt water so that paragraphs would learn to behave. The room laid its polite instruments out for me the way a surgeon lays out tools, not to intimidate, but to forestall improvisation. Improvisation, here, was treason, unless it could be made to look like policy. "When you leave," the Jesuit said, "take nothing, not even a smell." He smiled again with the 2/3 that belonged to mercy. "But take this sentence. An equation can start a war. A relic can end it. Ask yourself which is more dangerous to the century you love, a true equation or a comfortable relic. Then decide what to make." I did not answer. My mouth had learned too much in one day to trust itself with conclusions. We said nothing as we closed the doors we had opened. The hinges blessed us with their brief complaints. The lamp, bored and brave, led us out into the corridor where stone relearned how to be only stone. Behind us, the workshop of miracles rehearsed, a choir of glass humming scales until a moon decided to redden and the city decided to listen. Back in the public nave, light behaved. People behaved. A tourist paused beneath a halo and did not notice the roads stitched there. A sacristan adjusted a candle by the width of a doctrine. An organist practiced intervals I now knew were maps. I walked the prescribed corridor for a while, then allowed my foot one step into the diagonal the map room had shown me. The floor accepted me like a mother accepts a child who has just dirtied his Sunday clothes and tells the truth anyway. In my cell, I washed my hands and found under my nails a dust that smelled like copper and obedience. I scrubbed until the smell admitted it would be back tomorrow. I set the certificate on the table, the stamp of recognitum looking up at me like a small, domesticated moon. I told myself I would sleep. Instead, I sat and listened, not to bells, not to footsteps, not to the settling of wood, but to the workshop continuing in my mouth, the taste of renamed mechanisms, the aftertaste of comfort, the polite cruelty of wax-taking seal. When I did sleep, The dream brought me a choir wearing coats of mail stitched on the inside with letters too holy to touch. They sang a scale that skipped the forbidden intervals by placing its foot exactly where fear had suggested. Above them, lacquered paper dragons watched without blinking, eyes of charcoal, wings learning stillness as a discipline. The star clock's bone hand ticked not toward an hour, but toward a story. And when I woke, my tongue remembered salt. I understood, with the calm terror of someone seeing a shoreline in the wrong place, that the next night the moon would be closer to red, and that the right, when it came, would not ask my permission. It would ask my participation and call it confession. I lit a candle and let it burn lower than the rule allows. The puddle of wax made a map I could not read. The flame wavered toward my breath, then away. I did not blow it out. I watched until the wick leaned, then righted itself, a small rehearsal for a city. Then I closed my eyes and counted not to end the night, but to make room in it for what the lower gate would open, and for the story I would help commission even as I begged its mercy. The moon did not turn red. The city agreed to remember it that way. Clouds learned their lines and parted on cue. I walked with Brother Matteo beneath facades that gazed down like judges who had retired without resigning. Rome was unusually courteous. Pigeons made room, fountains quieted their boast to a murmur. A wind with library manners padded ahead to hold the next door. The hour did not ring. The hour arrived, already rung. At the fresco, the angel's hand was more patient than usual. Matteo pressed the seam. Plaster exhaled. The corridor beyond had memorized us. It kept its hands off our shoulders. I carried no book, no pen, no prayer, except the kind a man says when he has stopped negotiating with his own breath. We passed the black glass basin. The coin at its center was now a shadow with edges. The surface showed me a face slightly more guilty than mine. I lowered my eyes. Vanity is the only mirror that does not mind being looked at too long. The star clock waited 3 flights down, a shield propped to guard the softest part of a body that had nothing left soft. By day it is an instrument. Under the blood moon it is a choice pretending to be a season. The bone pointer rested between the twins and the scorpion. A politeness extended to men who want fate to feel like astronomy. Matteo lifted the pointer 1 notch. The notch accepted him the way a secret accepts a familiar sin. Somewhere inside the wall, wood unclasped. Sound traveled like an instruction no one wanted to overhear. The mechanism did not celebrate. It enrolled us. "Do not step on the retrograde figures with your whole foot," he said, as if reminding me to take off my hat at dinner. "Heel to toe. Let the sign carry only part of you. This keeps me safe? It keeps the room from learning you too quickly." He turned. His eyes were clean of kindness, not because he had run out, but because it would be wasted here. "You cannot keep safe what you also want to understand." The chapel had no windows. The moonness of the night entered by agreement, not by light. The floor glowed with the arithmetic of stars drawn backward, Aries wearing its horns behind, Pisces swimming upstream toward a source that refused to be a sea. The signs had been inlaid by hands that believed edges are an ethic. Between them, lines of powdered charcoal traced old circles, interrupted in places by salt-white crescents like teeth. The room smelled of extinguished candles, leather that remembered rain, wine that had taken vows. Above the door, lacquered paper dragons, the watchers hung still. Their eyes were charcoal coins, their mouths half open in a perpetual almost word. In a corner stood the relic forge's smaller brother, a brazier, lidded, its vents breathing in a rhythm that kept my own lungs from improvising. On a rail, coats of mail, the color of dried figs, watched us with the caution of tools that have learned they can be used to apologize for anything. Their hems glittered where fine chain had been stitched with angelic letters sharp enough to bruise a palm. They came quietly, as men do who have been instructed that their footsteps are confessions. Some wore tonsures, some wore the hair of practical captains. One had the careful shyness of a scribe who has never been scolded by a woman who loves him. None introduced themselves. Names are invitations to retaliation. A bell rang once somewhere above us, too far to be useful, close enough to be remembered if arrested. They formed a semicircle around the brazier. Matteo stood by the ambo where the book of names lay with the humility of a ledger that knows its pen will not be allowed to tremble. The Jesuit from the workshop arrived last, carrying a bowl of salted wine that took the torchlight and made it taste like iron. He set it on a shallow shelf just inside the retrograde zodiac, and nodded to me as if handing me an instrument I already knew how to play. The rite did not begin. It had begun years ago, and this was the part where we agreed to notice. A young monk, with shoulders that still believed in oars, placed 3 candles in a row, black, then white, then red, each shorter than the last, each with a wick that had already learned its lesson. He lit the black. Smoke climbed and refused, halfway, to be soot. The white waited without showing off. The red looked like a wound in a velvet glove. The young monk pricked his scribe's finger with a pin that had confessed the same work before. He let 1 drop fall into the bowl. The bowl answered with a sound like approval decided in advance. When he passed me the pin, my finger did not hesitate. Guilt prefers competence. My drop struck the surface and spread into the wine in a filament map, capillaries searching, rivers negotiating borders, a delta choosing several destinies at once. The Jesuit tilted the bowl and the filaments arranged themselves into a modest crown. He righted the bowl and the crown rejoined the republic of liquid. Blood remembers geometry even when we don't, he murmured. It loves circles. It tolerates squares. It distrusts straight lines. Matteo opened the book of names. I had expected Baroque cruelty. The script was tidy as parish accounts. Names, dates, short reasons that avoided adjectives like sinners avoid specifics. Mathematician who relocated stars inconveniently to doctrine. Midwife tallying too well. Poet hearing the outlawed interval and printing it in short poems. Captain who made pilgrimage routes safe without official blessing. Printer who refuses to smudge at command. Each name bore, to the left, a blank circle awaiting a mark. To the right, boxes labeled rectify, clarify, sanctify. Policy disguised as piety. I tasted metal though I had not raised the bowl again. The prior thin, without the cruelty thinness, often excuses intoned the first line of the litany. The men answered with the refrain I had heard in rehearsal, rectify, clarify, sanctify. On rectify, the black candle was snuffed between cupped hands, and the darkness did not grow. It became precise. On clarify, the white candle leaned, but remained. Clarity prefers endurance to spectacle. On sanctify, the red candle flared as if insulted, then steadied into the kind of flame that teaches children what obedience looks like when it is beautiful. The witch hunters were not a single order. You could hear their origins in the way they pronounced certain syllables, one shaped sanctify like a sailor, a rope in the mouth. Another curled. Rectify like a scholar used to reading Latin to a window. A third gave clarify the wide vowels of a field where wind has learned to stop. It moved me more than I wanted. Even policy can be prayer when enough human throat is spent on it. The Jesuit lifted the bowl. One by one we dipped our index finger, the writing finger, into salted wine, and drew on the stone just inside our footprints, a small curve, a personal crescent. You are here, the curve said without words. You admit it. He then took a ring from a velvet pouch, silver bezel, blue crust, and pressed it to the first name's margin. The ink dulled at its edges, not erased, but persuaded to be less certain. He spoke into the book the story that would replace the truth, and because he named no one wicked, the room agreed. Rectify, not a heretic, but a mathematician whose sky maps must be delayed for the safety of a harbor. Clarify, not a conspiracy, but a misprint that will not be reprinted. Sanctify, not a suppression, but a relic bestowed, a lens renamed, a shroud restitched with routes for grain. We were not summoning demons. We were commissioning narratives, signed in salt and wine by hands trained never to shake. There is a point in any rite when the room begins to think for you. It is not hypnosis. It is hospitality. I felt the floor under my heels, warm to the temperature of living consent. The retrograde figures did their work flipping habits, until fate stumbled and we could walk across it politely. The watchers above the door did not blink. Paper is a better witness than flesh because it resists the sentimentality of eyelashes. The prior turned another page. Names advanced, each with a note. A woman in a fishing village who delivered twins and therefore charted inheritances too precisely for a duke's ease. A painter whose halos concealed star maps we had not authored. A teacher who told children to keep their birthdays even if the city moved the feast. My throat tightened for that one. The Jesuit pressed the ring and told the room a softer story. The teacher had been reassigned to a monastery school with excellent bread, and her curriculum had been corrected. The ledger recorded assent. Upstairs, bread would be good that week. It always is when stories are obedient. Coats of mail were lifted with the tenderness of men helping friends into old uniforms. The stitching on the hems that spelled out angelic letters now served as grips. Hands took hold where praise had been etched. The first time I saw a palm close around laudate, I understood why we embroider weapons on the inside with prayers. A man needs something to hold when he pulls another away from a door. Names are handles. So are blessings. A captain with an unromantic scar down the left of his jaw stepped inside the backward zodiac and drew with salt a line that ran from Sagittarius to Virgo, a harvest route disguised as piety. If the moon reddens by agreement, the soldiers move under the saint's name, the Jesuit said. No one writes a protest when a relic leads. He looked at me, not unkindly. We are saving lives badly, which is sometimes better than saving them not at all. The red candle had dwindled to the size where flames move more sincerely, their vanity spent. The black was a memory. The white, a column of what you would see if order had a shape. The prior set aside the book of names and lifted a smaller ledger, the demon-packed registry, whose title had always felt like theater until it lay in his hands. He opened to a page with edges like eyelids. The writing was angular, legalistic, a clerk's stern charisma. The pacts were not with demons, they were with memory. On this night we agree to forget in this manner, on this night we agree to remember in that one. Signatures were small and effortful, the handwriting of men trying not to be themselves in case they were read by a future that kept their names. "We do not bargain with hell," Matteo said quietly. "We bargain with the part of ourselves that loves neatness more than truth. It is the only devil that attends consistently." One by one, we pricked the scribe's finger again and marked the registry not with our names, but with the small crescents we had drawn at our feet, the humble private geometry of being present. I felt no sacred sting, no thrill of theatrics, only the clear ache of adding weight to a scale that would tip a story somewhere. A child would sleep because a route changed. A scholar would go unpublished because a route changed. I wished to be simpler, and could not. The Jesuit brought forth a shard of glass mounted in brass, its edge flecked with old light. "A window that taught a crowd to see," he said. "We borrow its obedience." He held it such that the red candle shone through, staining his fingers a color men will name piety if you let them. "When the story leaves this room, it will pass through this. The shard asks nothing. It performs clarity, and then rests." He passed the shard to me. The glass cooled my palm with the tenderness of an instrument that does not mind being forgotten if its work is done. I raised it to the candle and watched my hand become a belfry of red bone. The thought was immediate, unforgivable, true. Bones are honest, because they dislike adjectives. I returned the shard, poorer for honesty, richer for regret. The rite deepened. The men began the chant again, and the room took a breath not because lungs required it, but because the floor's geometry had been taught to imitate life, rectify, clarify, sanctify. On the last syllable, the watchers twitched the slightest creak of lacquer, a dry articulation, a whisper rose that was not speech, paper accepting a draft. Then stillness again, the kind earned by discipline. If I had spoken then, my voice would have sounded like a thief. Matteo called a name I knew from the workshop's margins, a poet who heard the outlawed interval and smuggled it into lullabies. "He will be moved," the prior said, "to a monastery on a cliff where wind conspires with sleep." The Jesuit pressed the ring, dulled the ink, wrote in the white, "Clarify." Songs reassigned to anonymous pilgrim tunes. Somewhere, a child's night would be less strange. Somewhere else, adulthood would arrive with one less tool for honest discomfort. I signed the crescent and wanted to apologize to the wind. Then it happened. The thing that rites learn to provide at the precise moment a mind might otherwise recover. A candle humbled, a chain somewhere beyond the wall released a single swift link. The brazier's lid lifted and settled as if breathing were a metal. The floor warmed. The retrograde zodiac's inlays, which had absorbed our regard without complaint, offered back a thin brightness along their engraved edges, not light so much as agreement made visible. The hum I had heard near the Chronicle found a harmony in the workshop's busier pitch. They braided. They taught my ribs to be an instrument. The prior closed the registry. "We have commissioned enough obedience," he said. His voice had the fatigue of a shepherd who knows the wolves have learned to read. "Now we remember the cost." From a narrow cabinet, Matteo withdrew a small packet wrapped in linen tied with a thread the color of a question unanswered for a season. He untied it and unfolded the cloth. Inside lay a simple nail, hand-forged, head slightly off-center, shank with the wobble honesty demands from metal taught without machines. It had no relic label, it needed none. Each rite ends with what begins houses, he said. We fix nothing to walls tonight. We fix ourselves. He placed the nail on the stone, just where one of the grooves the patient plumbing began. He poured a trickle of salted wine. The trickle accepted the groove's instruction and went where the room wanted. The nail glittered only once. This is not blood, Matteo said, eyes on the brazier. It is the taste chosen by men who prefer to call what they do sacrament. He gestured. We removed our coat's linen for some, coarse wool for others, a mail shirt for the captain, and laid them, one by one, on the stone so that the hems with stitched letters touched the nail. You do not nail the world to your story, he said. You nail your stories to a place the world will not likely see. That is the mercy we can afford. A small one, adolescent compared to justice. But tonight, we are only adolescents with keys. I understood then, with the calm that arrives when a room challenges you to be eloquent and you choose not to be, that the rite was not a spell, but a discipline of distribution, of doubt, of mercy, of narrative, of fear. The blood moon had commissioned us to divide faithfully what a crowd will otherwise divide violently. I did not love it. I did not hate it. I recognized it the way you recognize a cousin who resembles your sin. The prior lifted his hand for the final refrain, but he did not speak. The men understood and began, softly enough that the brazier could have been the one singing, rectify, clarify, sanctify. On the last word, each man drew with powdered salt a single line outward from where he stood to the margin of the zodiac, a private exit. Lines to leave by, the Jesuit said, so that you do not take with you a circle that would like to keep you. This sea, he extinguished the red candle with the wet pinch of skilled fingers. The white took one last dignified breath and went out. The black remained unlit, a lesson about beginnings we preferred not to draw publicly. The watchers above the door made no sound, but I had the sensation that their eyes, charcoal, coins of attention, had recorded the proper number of crescents drawn and accepted. Paper can count without boasting. We replaced the coats. We gathered nothing. Even the flake of salt that clung to my soul I gave to the threshold with a small scuff like an apology. The brazier's vents went slow. The star clock did not await us. It expected us. Matteo returned the bone pointer to its resting, and the notch thanked him with a click that meant, the story will now travel on its own feet. You may pretend to sleep. In the corridor, the black glass basin held a new coin. I did not see who had given it. Perhaps the watchers, with paper hands. Perhaps me, with a thought I had not caught in time. The coin was ordinary, the year plain, the face a face, the rim nicked by life. But the way it sat exactly in the center, without being centered by any human hand, was the kind of tidiness that makes a skeptic nervous. Leave it, Matteo said, reading my impulse to rescue certainty. Some accuracy is earned. Some is arranged. We function either way. These hey, in yorter, my. At the fresco, the angel's hand looked less patient and more warning, but that was the hour talking. We sealed the door. The seam learned to resemble innocence again. Above, the nave had repopulated with the sleep of the city, the shuffle of early cleaners who know where the echoes are stored, the breath of a guard measuring his rounds to a hymn he calls a habit. Outside, The moon performed white. Inside me, the red was polite enough to wait for interpretation. I walked the pilgrim corridor and, at the diagonal, allowed myself one step off. The floor had anticipated me. It made room. On the square, a woman hushed a child with a thumb to her own lips, not to silence him, but to persuade sound to stand behind him like a friend. A cat crossed and paused to consider the stone, as if the stone had confessed something only animals hear correctly. In my cell, the certificate recognitum watched me without eyes. I set it aside and washed my hands in a bowl that had taught water to be secular. The salt left a ghost on my skin. I lifted the lamp and saw that in the whorls of my scribe's finger, a fine white crescent had lodged the shape I had drawn on the floor. I licked my thumb and rubbed until the crescent blurred, but did not vanish. Some rites are designed to linger at a scale too honest for soap. I sat. I did not write. The chronicle had taught my hand patience. The workshop had taught it suspicion. The rite had taught it to leave the page alone when the page might lead the world too quickly. I closed my eyes and listened to the city negotiate its night. Somewhere, a cartwheel obeyed a rut. Somewhere a man rehearsed a lie he hoped would pass as courtesy. Somewhere a grandmother lit a candle without looking to see whether the calendar approved. The flame she raised accustomed itself to the room's oxygen and then taught the room to be a little more honest about breathing. When I finally slept, the dream returned me to the chapel without windows. The watchers hung above the door like polite verdicts. The retrograde zodiac wanted a conversation about direction. I put my heel to toe and offered it only part of me. The brazier opened a slit of its lid and released a thread of warmth that traced the path of my ribs. The book of names lay closed, and on its cover, a thin film of dust accepted a single crescent as if it had been part of the binding all along. I woke before the bells and felt the taste of sacred salt on the roof of my mouth. The window admitted a square of morning, the exact color of work. I placed my hand over my heart, not to swear, not to pray, but to keep count. And I understood, with the ease that comes after difficult nights, that every story I would tell from here forward would carry the small geometry of that room. I would not pretend the moon had done it. We had, and because we had, I would speak more gently, not in mercy for the powerful, but because gentleness is the one tone that teaches memory to return without panicking. The rite had not summoned demons. It had called the city to attend to itself in an antique mirror. On nights like that, mirrors behave. They keep adjectives to a minimum. They let you see where the salt has dried and where the charcoal still waits. If you were sitting across from me now, I would hand you the shard of window and let you choose which light to keep. Since you are not, I will tell you the one instruction I brought out whole and unbargained. Do not mistake quiet for consent. Do not mistake order for care. Do not mistake ritual for truth. And when a corridor offers you a diagonal, step once, with your heel first, and your toe remembering the line of salt. The moon will do what moons do. Your memory will do what you permit. Choose generously for those who have been edited into obedience. Choose accurately for those who will inherit the ledger. Matteo met me in the sacristy before lauds. He touched the cuff of my sleeve, where a grain of salt glittered like a polite survivor, and flicked it back into the world. You will sleep now, he said, or you will think you have. Either is sufficient. What happens next? I asked. The thing that always happens, he said. We return the tools to their drawers and watch for the places where the story fails to behave. Then we decide whether to correct the story or correct ourselves. And if we correct ourselves? He smiled with the tired 2/3 that belong to mercy. Then the city learns a new hymn. He turned to go and added, without looking back, and someone lights a candle the calendar has forgotten. That is when we know we have done no permanent harm. I did not ask how often that candle is lit. Questions like that prefer to be answered by years, not by men. I returned to my cell, turned the certificate face down so it would not teach my table to be obedient, and set the iron key on top, as if weight were a kind of confession. Outside, dawn rehearsed being day. Inside, I rehearsed being honest. The rehearsal went poorly. That is how you know it has begun. Morning arrived with the color of work, which is to say it arrived wearing the right uniform. I lay still and counted the quiet as if silence were a currency I might finally spend honestly. The night's salt had dried into the whorls of my writing finger. When I touched it to my tongue, the taste was smaller than guilt and larger than apology. It is fashionable, in certain corridors, to say that the city sleeps between bells. The truth is ruder. We pretend to sleep so that our questions can dress in softer shoes and go out without an escort. I walked the nave before Louds and found the building innocent of everything we had done to it. Candles practiced their arithmetic. A cleaner sang out of tune with the organ that was not yet playing. The fresco seam held the angel's hand in place without pride. Upstairs has good manners. Downstairs has memory. In the space between them, people try to live. A child crossed my path, counting her steps in twos. She lost the number at the transept, frowned, and began again with an authority I envied. Her grandmother followed, carrying a matchbox with the gravity of a magistrate, though all it held was the means to disturb darkness politely. When the child asked why the candle near the side altar was missing, the grandmother said, "Because today the calendar forgot us, so we will remember it," and struck a match that made a sound like a small verdict. The flame stood up, and the calendar, somewhere inside its thick skin of certainty, found it useful to blush. I tell you this because the next part of my confession lives there, in that blush. The exact width of space where institution and memory fail to agree, and a human thumb decides between them. I returned to my cell and placed side by side the three things that had learned my pulse: the iron key, the recognitum certificate, and a blank page. The key looked like work made honest by time. The certificate looked like permission taught to sit up straight. The page looked like land no empire had yet measured. I have seen men drunk on blankness. I am not braver than they are. I am only more tired of being elegant. You have heard the bones of my story. The fresco that was never meant to open, the chains that teach a reader to stand in one place long enough for a page to finish its work, the chronicle that misfiles centuries the way some men misfile debts, the workshop that baptizes mechanism until it answers to a saint's name, the rite that commissions narratives on nights the moon consents to be our accomplice. If you have stayed with me, you have also learned the hum under all of it, the note lower than confession and higher than command. It is not the sound of the church, it is the sound of administration falling in love with itself. The hour after a rite is the hour institutions prefer because relief can be mistaken for righteousness. I did not trust the relief. I walked to the star clock and touched the bone pointer without moving it, the way you touch a sleeping child's hair when you know you have taught that child a complicated song. The wheel's constellations did not flash their policy at me. That is not how temperament behaves in daylight. They only sat, elegant as explanations on a feast day, and let me understand that the next time would be easier. That is what temptation always promises. Ease that looks like competence. Brother Matteo found me there, his keys resting against his hip like a tired choir. He did not ask what I intended. Men who live among mechanisms learn to despise intentions. He set a palm on the star clock stand as if the wood might be feverish and said, "You know now that story is a tool. So is doubt. The question is which one you can put down without losing your hands." I thought the question was whether I should keep my vows, I said. "It is," he agreed. "But vows are made of story and doubt. The child's proportions were wrong when you took them. You are old enough to tailor them now." We stood in the stairs draft and let the building give us back our breath 1 degree at a time. "There is a ledger we do not shelve," he said. "You will write in it if you intend to be more useful than devout." "What ledger is that?" "The ledger of returns," he said. "It has no location. It is kept wherever a person decides to bring something back that was edited away. The only way to add an entry is to place it in a mouth that will repeat it without being paid." "It sounds like gossip," I said, "because cruelty is my defense against most truths." "It is testimony," he said softly. "Gossip is testimony we haven't yet forgiven." He left me with the pointer and the problem of a day that would insist, as all days do, upon behaving. I took the key and the certificate and went to the only room that could bear what I intended, the Chronicle's room, where the hum had taught my ribs a discipline. Opening the Chronicon Phantasma is easier the second time. That sentence should alarm you more than anything else I've told. Habit is the saint that does the most damage with the fewest witnesses. The book yawned and allowed my blood another loan. I turned to the century that was not, the page that had been burned just enough to warn the future. The red, "Do not speak" command sat there with the authority of a law that once worked and now wore itself for ceremonial reasons. I put the certificate on the lectern beside it, a ridiculous gesture like asking permission from a painting, but I have learned to include in my superstitions the habits that keep me from lying to myself too quickly. I took out a small strip of paper, the kind scribes use to test ink, and wrote a name, the child's grandmother's saint, the one the calendar had misplaced. I wrote the date the grandmother had said, not the one the ledger preferred. I wrote it in a hand I knew would be decipherable after I was dust. Then I slid the strip under the Chronicle's bar, not to hide it, but to let the book press it into the shape of the room's memory. "You are unwise," said the Jesuit from the workshop behind me, which is to say, he said it to the part of me that had already agreed. "I am obedient," I said, surprising myself by meaning it. "To the ledger of returns." He came closer and peered, as one peers at a stain one wants to forgive. "A strip of paper is not a counterweight for a century. A grandmother is," I said. "This is only the receipt." He considered, then did what only certain kinds of clever men remember to do. He withdrew his intelligence from the argument and lent me his craft. He took up the blue ring, dabbed it against his palate, an old chemist's private test for humility, and pressed half its face to the margin opposite the red command. The ink there paled, sufficiency instead of erasure, and he wrote in its throat a line so small the chronicle might someday convince itself it had always contained it, except as needed for homes. He set the ring down and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, as if he had eaten something that would later turn out to have been true. "Go," he said, with Mercy's 2/3 of a smile. "You have errands in a city that is trying to remember how to be a city." I went. Not to the arches and facades and plazas that perform civilization, but to the places where story gets traded for bread and back again. The market, the ferry steps, the clinic that smells like boiled cloth and patience, the corner where a printer stands between paper and blame. I did not preach. I have never been good at preaching. I can hear my own performance, and it makes me want to apologize. I asked questions the way a man asks where he might sit when all the chairs are taken. I wrote down what would otherwise be misfiled: a fishmonger's feast day, a mason's lost saint, the date, a river rose, and therefore a wedding was postponed, and therefore a child was conceived one day later, and therefore the math of a family's grief will always be off by one. I learned the names of cats that belonged more to Bibiana's night than to the carpenter's, and I drew a map of how their madness taught us to move a procession. I helped a baker rewrite a recipe that had relied on a winter that no longer existed since the calendar was corrected, and we called it a miracle because the loaves no longer split in the wrong places. At each errand I told the same soft charge: keep your dates. Do not let the calendar have them until it earns them. Write your grandmother's saints on the back of receipts, and keep the receipts in a tin that once held mints. Mints go quickly, and saints must wait. If your street changes its name, keep a pebble from the old curb in your pocket so that your feet remember which way to point when grief is trying to find you. If a hymn wavers out of tune, ask the organist to keep it that way for one Sunday. There is a map hiding in the wrong chord that someone in the back pew needs to read. A man at the ferry asked if I was starting a movement. "No," I said. "I am returning one." It had been filed under dangerous. He laughed in the unmannerly way. Freedom laughs the first day it breathes. Then he put the date of his father's death in my hand, and I put it in my pocket, as if it were a flake of blue paint from heaven itself. You cannot carry everyone's anniversaries. You can carry enough to teach your posture a better ethic. I went back to the Chronicle at noon, because noon is when lies take their shoes off and nap. The strip of paper had warmed to the lectern's temper. I slid it out and wrote 2 more names, one a poet reassigned to a monastery on a cliff, the other a teacher whose curriculum had been corrected. Underneath I wrote the simple sentence institutions hate. They are still alive. I placed that sentence so the Red Command could smell it. Paper is a nose when you need it to be. In the workshop, the Jesuit showed me how to untell a relic without breaking the object. You rename the mechanism back to itself, he said, and you give the story to someone who will feed it less. We practiced on a lens that had been called a spear too long. When we finished, it was a lens again, and the saint it had borrowed had gone home to rest. A prince will kneel less, he warned me. Good. Princes' knees are expensive, from the Ledger of Saints. I copied no ring, no blue 3 erased names into a notebook I would never show anyone with a title. I slid the notebook into the lintel of a door used only by cleaners at dawn. That is where the city keeps its most accurate archives, in the muscle memory of people who prop chairs against locks, not because they fear thieves, but because they mistrust forgetfulness. At vespers, a visitor asked me, as visitors do, where to find proof. I wanted to hand her the chronicle. I wanted to walk her into the workshop and let her smell the polite chemistry of persuasion. Instead, I pointed at the grandmother's candle. Proof is a poor diet for faith, and faith is a poor diet for justice. But memory can eat both and turn them into muscle. Look for the seams, I told her. Rooms that align too neatly. Stories that never learn to limp. She thanked me the way polite people thank directions that won't fit on a map and went to light a candle with the firm grace of a person too intelligent to clap after the miracle ends. Night approached, carrying the sound of carts agreeing to be tired. I returned to the chapel without windows, not to perform, but to admit. The watchers held their lacquered patience. The retrograde zodiac kept its backward grammar. The brazier's lid was cold, and the book of names lay closed, which is not the same as finished. I set my palm on the stone where our coats had touched the nail and felt the room take an inventory of my heat. I am leaving, I said aloud, to the air that had learned to imitate belief. Not from the church, though perhaps I do not know that yet, but from the hour that confuses obedience with accuracy. The room did not object. It has heard braver speeches delivered with worse sentences. It has also watched men rescind them within a week. Rooms are patient as oceans with sailors. I took the iron key and did the most disobedient thing a priest can do with a key. I brought it upstairs, not to keep, to show. I placed it in the palm of the archivist, the cave-bird exact man who moves like a creature meant for smaller skies, and said, "This belongs to the door behind the Annunciation. It chose me. I am asking you to let it choose less often." He held the weight and did not flinch. "Keys are honest," he said, repeating my first sin back to me as a possible benediction. "They admit they cannot save. They only decide who suffers first." He closed his fingers around the tooth. "I will forget where I put it," he said, and I understood the offering. Some forgetfulness is a sacrament, if it is chosen on behalf of others. So here is the end of my confession, and the beginning of your work, because a confession that does not hand you something to carry is only a performance. Keep your birthdays accurately even when the feast moves. Write your dead on paper and on the underside of a drawer and on the first page of a cookbook. When your street is renamed, keep 2 names in your mouth until the newer one learns how to be kind. If a book is chained, read it where it hangs and listen for the hum that is not yours. If you hear it deepen, step back and teach your pulse some insolence. When a story arrives too neat, check it for stitches. If you find a stitch, tug but gently. If a song drifts slightly out of tune, stand nearer. Someone has mapped a meeting into the dissonance and may need a witness more than a melody. When institutions tell you why a century did not happen, light a candle for the births that did. When a lens is called a spear, look through it until it becomes a lens again. When you are offered a miracle, ask for the mechanism and bless it by its honest name. When you are offered fear, ask where it plans to sleep. If it intends your mouth, refuse it the bed. Teach your children to keep receipts. Teach them to write on the receipts the saints the calendar forgot, and the streets the city misfiled. Teach them that maps are promises made by hands, and that hands have their own politics. Teach them to clean early in the morning, when the building breathes the truth out by accident. Teach them that silence is rarely sacred, it is usually enforced. Teach them when to be impolite to a rule and polite to a grandmother. I have no proof that will satisfy the mouths trained to ask for it in Latin. I have only a ledger of returns written on ordinary paper by ordinary hands. Yours, mine, the woman with the matchbox, the child who restarts her counting with sovereign ease. The chronicle will continue to hum. The workshop will continue to baptize verbs into nouns. The star clock will continue to encourage. Let them. Systems are inevitable. So is memory, when fed. If you wake in the night and feel a thought you were taught to fear, do not snuff it. Let it burn low. Low flames keep better company. Place your hand over your heart, not to swear, not to pray, but to keep count. If a corridor offers you a diagonal, take one step with your heel first, toe remembering the line of salt, and listen for the building to answer. If it answers with patience, go on. If it answers with appetite, go home, and write the date on 3 scraps of paper and hide them where only cleaning finds them. Cleaning is the last honest liturgy. This is the part where, if I were younger, I would promise you safety. I am not, so I promise you consequence. You will be lonelier for a season. You will be kinder for longer. You will discover that your questions are less knives than lanterns when you hold them correctly. Carry them low. Let the light lick the floor. You will see the seams. Do not stop asking questions. The most dangerous thing to them is memory returning. If you need words to start with, take these. Where does this story leave a bruise? Whom does this calendar ask me to forget? Which mechanism has been dressed for Mass? And can I love it better by undressing it? If you need a prayer, use the one I finally learned to mean. May your doubts stay gentle, your questions stay patient, and your memory, yours, your family's, your city's, find its way back through every corridor where the lights were made to dim. I will sleep now, or pretend to, and let this story walk on its own feet. If you want it, it will find you. If you do not, it will wait. Because waiting is how certain doors remain doors. When you are ready, you will open one that was never meant to be found, and you will not be alone. A grandmother's match will go scratch, a child will restart a count, and the century that was not will make room for the life you insist upon remembering.